The Black Talk Radio Network is made possible in part with help from the Black Talk Media Project, a North Carolina-based nonprofit engaged in the production and distribution of independent digital black media. Find out more by going to blacktalkradionetwork.com or blacktalkmediaproject.org and look for the menu tab, Crowdfunding Black Media. Black Talk Media Project, helping to provide you with new black media for the new millennium. And opinions expressed by callers, guests, and hosts do not necessarily reflect those of the Black Talk Radio Network and Black Talk Media Project. Black Talk Radio is new black media for the new millennium.
Good evening. This is Onaji Muid, host of Race Treaty that comes to you every Friday evening, 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. The Race Treaty is based upon the fact that racism has been operating for at least 500 years, and the consequence of this false notion of different races and the justification of one group creating a hierarchy to, in fact, oppress for the purpose of exploitation of another or other groups is something that we're still fighting. We call this period a period of decolonization. And in so doing, we will relate to different international covenants and conventions and protocols to see how we can move out from this mess we find ourselves in. And as we do that, we have different academics, organizers, activists on our program from time to time. And tonight, this is no different. And we're going to be exploring the topic in this program and throughout 2018, the question of independent institutions, the question of controlling institutions that cater to African people. Some say African Americans. And of course, we've gone through a number of categorizations from colored to Negro to African American. In fact, even before that, when we first got here, we were called who we are, Africans. So in that discussion, one of the primary institutions that we have had and have been working with many contradictions, of course, but nonetheless, institutions that have created an avenue, a vehicle, a conduit for us to learn skills, academics, and to move on to become contributors to our communities. I'm speaking about historically Black colleges and universities. ICRAM, the International Human Rights Association for American Minorities, has joined this struggle with those who have been doing that for centuries now, in that they have created a book called Preserving HBCU's Billion-Dollar Legacy. And this was done under the title of International Law, Self-Determination, and the Rights to Institutions. And when we talk about rights of institutions, we're speaking about, at least at minimum, the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, and given reference to Article 27 that states, paraphrasing, that any minority, be it religious, be it linguistic, being ethnic, has a right to their institutions. And we have with us this evening a gentleman who has spent most of his, probably his adult life in historically black colleges and universities as a student, undergrad, I believe as a grad student, as well as a doctorate, a PhD, and teaching in those same institutions. So he has a perspective that few have who have been so intertwined with historically black colleges and universities. And we have with us no other than our brother, Tikari Bioko, if I'm saying it right, also known as Ray Winbush. My brother, welcome to Race Treaty.
How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, doing real good. Always good to have you in my presence, be it through telephone, through Facebook, or whatever it is, or face to face. It's always good. Brother Winbush is a scholar and an activist. Those things I talked about, he fits all those categories. He's known for his systems thinking approaches to understanding the impact of racism or white supremacy on the global African community. His writings, consultations, and research has been instrumental in understanding developmental stages of black males, public policy, and its connection to compensatory justice. Compensatory justice. Okay, I got it right that second time. Relationships between blacks, males, and females, infusion of African studies into school curricula, and the impact of, check this out, hip hop culture on the contemporary African landscape. He is currently a research professor, as well as the director of Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Again, welcome, my brother. Welcome to Race Treaty.
It's good to be here.
So, if you could help the audience understand your connection to historically black colleges and universities, is it correct that you, in fact, obtained your undergrad degree at such an institution?
Yes, I did. I obtained my undergraduate degree from Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama. I'm proud to say my son and daughter also graduated from Oakwood, and have taught at, I always got to count now, I've taught at 4 HBCUs in the United States, Fisk University, Oakwood University, where I graduated from, Alabama A&M University, and now at Morgan State University in Baltimore. So you HBCU tradition, yeah.
Now you skipped over, your master's degree and your doctorate. Were those also degrees obtained at historically black institutions?
No, I got my master's and PhD at the University of Chicago in psychology. All 3 of my degrees are in psychology, one from an HBCU, my undergraduate, and my graduate degrees from University of Chicago.
Well, we ain't mad at you, brother, because you're still doing the do, so we ain't mad at you.
Well, it's ironic that, like, if I wanted to get a degree in black studies, there's only one major doctoral program in black studies, that's at Howard. The challenge about HBCUs, and we'll get into that, the challenge about HBCUs is that, it's hard to get advanced degrees, not in other subjects, but in black studies particularly. It would be like, if I go to Notre Dame, I would expect to get a degree, or could get a degree, I should say, in the history of Catholicism. Or if I went to Brandeis, I would get a degree in Jewish studies, or could get a degree in Jewish studies. If I went to Wellesley, I could probably get a doctorate in women's studies. I mean, I could do it, but you get my point. But yes, in black colleges, they've made sure that doctoral degrees in black studies are at a premium. And again, the only one that I know of, and I'm pretty sure about this, is Howard University. That's the only place where you can get a PhD in black studies. So,
Well,
and we'll talk about some of the politics later on. So go
yeah,
ahead.
we'll certainly, go back and place it into national context in terms of how they came about and what they've done. But I want to talk a little bit more about you. Why did you become a psychologist?
I missed that last part.
Yeah, why did you become a psychologist? What was it that drove you
Oh,
to actually study psychology?
well, it's funny, when I went to Oakwood for my undergraduate studies, I actually came there as a history major. And for the first year when I was at Oakwood, I decided I was going to be a historian. And so I was really interested in how we had gotten to where we had gotten. And that was one reason why I wanted to study history. Toward my end of my freshman year, I took a course in psychology, and I said maybe the question is not how we got to where we are, because we know where we are technically now, but how do we think about where we are? So I was interested in the behavior of African people, and I want to know why we think, what produces an Angela Davis and a Condoleezza Rice, who only lived about 2 miles from each other in Birmingham, Alabama.
Mm.
So I was interested in how Black people thought and what they were thinking about, and what did they think of oppression as well as liberation. So that's when I decided to switch over from history to psychology. And even now, I still love history. It's probably, other than psychology itself, is probably what I read most of, is history, particularly, African history.
Mm-hmm. So, were there any mentors?
Oh yeah.
Any individuals along the way that helped you make that transition?
Yeah, the two biggest mentors, influential on my life on the undergraduate level, it was Earl Gooding, who was a sociologist and an educator at Oakwood University. He helped convince me. I had been fairly well convinced, but he really kind of deepened me in psychology. At the graduate level, it was John Hope Franklin, the historian, who taught me at University of Chicago and really became a lifelong mentor to me. So ironically, a social scientist, Gooding, and a historian, John Hope Franklin, really kind of pulled all of that stuff together, and those were probably my two greatest professional mentors.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is Kwanzaa season, December 26th to January 1st. So it's beautiful that we were able to give reference and also acknowledgement to these two giants in your life. I'm not too familiar at all, in fact, with Earl Gooding, but I am with, of course, John Hope Franklin. Is Mr. Gooding? Is he still living?
Yes, he is. He just retired from Alabama A&M University. It's really ironic. He was the chair of the Department of Behavioral Sciences at Oakwood University, and then when I went to University of Chicago after 2.5 years, the former provost at Oakwood asked me to come back and teach at Oakwood, and I became Gooding's boss. It was really weird because he had been my mentor, and now I was his boss. But we became friends. We became close friends and colleagues and stuff like that. And he's one of those people that labored at HBCUs all of his life and just mentored a bunch of people, not just me. I decided to, I left Oakwood, went over to Alabama A&M, and then to Vanderbilt. I taught at Vanderbilt for like 14 years, But the influence of HBCUs have always been with me. Again, I told you 2 of my 3 children graduated from HBCUs. My daughter's a dentist, and my son is an attorney.
My
you know.
goodness.
So, and then my oldest son, the attorney, is married to his campus sweetheart at Oakwood, who's a physician. You know, so we've got a strong history and support of HBCUs in our family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, let me still stay on the subject of psychology. In your years as a student of psychology, in your years as a professor, activist, and administrator, what kind of lessons could you share with the audience that has been mined over those, 50 years?
Yeah. I mean, this will be my 44th year in higher education, my 44th year. So it's almost a half a century. And I think the thing that, and this is where I guess one of the other influences in my life is Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. When I first met her in 1980, she helped shape my ideas about just being a Black person on the planet. And, Dr. Welsing was, I think the thing that I've learned the most is that a lot of Black people are very confused. A lot of us are very confused, and I'm not just looking at it objectively. There were points in my life that I was confused about who I was in terms of identity. But most of our people remain relatively confused about where their place is in a system of white supremacy. So it's not that they're stupid. Like, I think that Omarosa Manigault is confused. I think Condoleezza Rice is confused. I think Lil Wayne is confused. And I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm just saying that confusion to me is a lack of understanding who you are as an African within the system of white supremacy, and how you move about throughout that system. That's what, to me, confusion is.
So confusion is one of the things that you've highlighted in this profession. What other things would you say rings loud as you use the lens of psychology to look at our people and look at our situation? What else rings loud for you?
I think one of the greatest challenges for Black people is to get in touch with their African self. And what I mean by African self, I'm talking about like the work of Marimba Ani, what she did in Urugu and Let the Circle Be Unbroken, in terms of how do you, and I know this sounds simplistic, but it's a deeper question. How do you act, think, be like an African in a system that is hostile towards that type of being? How do you treat your brothers and sisters? How do you tell the truth and lie? How do you say, I'm not going to succumb to the vulgar materialism of what the society encourages me to do? How do I return to a sense that me and I, are not as important as us as a people? How do you do that? And there's actual research. Naeem Akbar, who I think Onaji, he found that Black people who have an early experience with being a Black person, that they come out of the womb and their parents encourages that rediscovery or discovery of their African self, actually live longer lives. They live longer. I mean, Black people die before anybody in this society, men and women, prior to the age of 60. We die fast. You probably heard over the weekend about this news anchor that was in, Atlanta. She died, I think she had a stroke at 46 or something like that, young. Those who live after 60, Black people who live beyond the age of 60 live longer than white people. So 60 plus, we live longer. And those who do live beyond 60 are those who have histories of being anchored in their communities. They work for them. They immerse themselves in, culturally in it. So it's almost like being Black is good for your physical and mental health. It's like, giving our children, we give our children vaccinations for rubella and mumps and measles and all this other stuff. But I think the most important vaccination we can give is a cultural inoculation, like deepen yourself within that. And as a psychologist, I've been privileged to see the results of that in people who chose and choose to become African and those who don't. And those who don't usually wind up, for example, being dragged out of the White House by Secret Service people. They wind up being alienated from who they are as well as their own community.
That is reminiscent of the work of Viktor Frankl, who said he actually attributes his survival and his mental capacity by affirming that there's meaning to life and that he saw himself getting out of the concentration camps. And of course, he went on to become a very famous, I think his background, I don't know if it's psychiatry or psychology, but
it was psychiatry.
Psychiatry?
You're right. Right. And Frankel's book was one of my early influences. It's what's amazing, Onaji? We look at other cultures, like, for example, that's a great citation about Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps by immersing himself culturally in the Jewish tradition. If you look at people as varied as Geronimo, he remained, and Cochise, they remain warriors because they immerse themselves respectively in Lakota and Navajo culture. Apache culture. So you see Japanese like that. You see Italians like that. But it's amazing when it comes to Black people, you see other people living longer, prospering by following the traditions of their historical culture. But when you tell people, let's be African, I don't know what that means. Well, let's celebrate Kwanzaa. Brother, I don't celebrate Kwanzaa. I do St. Patrick's Day, so we'll see Black folk dressing up in green on March 17th, and they're about as Irish as this box that I'm looking at in my office, But if they reject their own culture, and as a psychologist, I'm interested in that. Why do they do that? How can a Ben Carson pray for President Trump at the White House and ask God to bless him? That's confusion. And I think that confusion, in some Black folk becomes pathological.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I talk about some of that in my book, The Warrior Method, about how you can be so confused that you commit like a cultural suicide. And many of our people have actually done that.
Those of you who are turning in late, this is Onaji Mawid, host of Race Treaty. And our guest is Raymond Ray Winbush, Tikari Bioko. And he mentioned that his book, The Warrior Method, in fact, much of Brother Winbush's life is actually documented. His early childhood narrative is detailed in his first book, The Warrior Method. Brother Winbush is one of 5 children and the middle of 3 sons born to Howard Winbush, Cleveland, Ohio. Mm-hmm. A steel worker, and Dorothy Winbush, a housewife. in a depressed economy, low wages, and racial discrimination, produced financial hardships for the family. In 1948, the year of Brother Winbush's birth, and the family left Pittsburgh and moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and started life anew. At the early age, request from an elementary teacher, he was tested and scored high on the standard Binet intelligence test. Tell us about that test. What is it? What does it tell us? What does it not tell us? How was it being used, or how has it been used to lift up and bolster the system of white supremacy?
Well, it's funny. When I was first tested when I was in the 4th grade at a place called Charles Chestnut Elementary School. That was my elementary school. Now, obviously, I didn't know what the Stanford Binet intelligence test was, because I was what? I don't know how old you are in the 4th grade, about 10, something like that, whatever. So I scored high on it, and they told me I needed to go. They told my parents we can either skip him 2 grades or he has to go to this, advanced placement school. And so my parents chose to send me to the school because they didn't want me to be like too young in a class of older people. Long story short, the Stanford Binet is an intelligence test, that was created by this white racist psychologist in the early 1920s named Louis Terman out in California. And he said we need to get a measure of who is intelligent and who isn't intelligent. The problem with the test is that it's racially biased. So I'll give you a quick example. I ain't supposed to do this on the radio, but I doubt if any of the psychologists listen to it. But there's an item on the test where you have a square. If your listeners can envision a square, and you tell the person who's taking the test, you have lost a quarter on this playground. It's like a square. How would you go about finding it? Well, if the person shows some kind of systematic way of finding it, like go up and then go, move over 2 feet, go across like that, they get 2 points. If they show something that's somewhat, organized, like, go up to one corner, search that one, then go down to the diagonal corner, so you give them 1 point. And if they just say, like, zigzag through the schoolyard, you give them 0. So when I was doing my internship at the University of Chicago, I had this little black boy, and I never will forget this. He was probably about 8, and I was giving him a Stanford Binet, and I told him what he should do with this, lost quarter in the schoolyard question. He said, as our people do. He says, so this is a schoolyard? I said, yeah. He said, you lost a quarter? I said, yeah, that's the call and response of our culture. He said, well, first of all, I would get 10 of my boys, and I would line them up about 2 feet apart, and I would tell them to walk and look down till they got to the other end. I thought that was an absolutely brilliant answer, because it didn't, you assume individual effort, but his African self as a little boy assumed group effort. So I gave him 2 points for that answer. When I took it back to my internship supervisor, who was white, and I told him what the little boy had said, he said, you give him 0 for that. I said, why? He said, this is about individual effort, not collective effort. So I said, really? So he said, yeah. So when he left the room, my supervisor left the room, I gave the boy a 2 again. I didn't care. So, that's, I think, is illustrative of how these tests are biased towards Eurocentric ideas and standards. And so, do I give IQ tests? I haven't given one in years. But I've critiqued them, and they've been lawsuits against them, and I think they're a tiny measure of what a person is, intellectually speaking.
Those of you
of course, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Of course, there's some black psychologists like Robert Williams out at Washington University in St. Louis who developed a test called the Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. I can't say the initials of that on the air, but you can get it. And he did one for children called Son of the BIT, CA. And that test is weighted towards white people. So they'll say, what is Mother's Day? Well, white people say it's the second Sunday in May or something. Black folk in the inner city will say it's when, the welfare checks come. So he could deliberately bias the test towards black folk that we can pass and they can't. So I don't put too much stock. Most black psychologists don't put too much stock in IQ tests. I think probably the best thing about IQ is that you can study intelligence. I could right now, as a psychologist, estimate that the IQ of the so-called president of the United States is somewhere right bordering on moronic, at around 85. And which is, if you want to get technical, one standard deviation below the mean IQ of 100 in the United States, because he's not smart at all. But other than that, that's about it. They're culturally biased.
Culturally biased. So we've been talking to Brother Ray Winbush, and he's shared with us his life, his childhood. He shared with us some of his education pursuits. In fact, obtaining a doctorate in philosophy and teaching in a number of universities throughout the country. So we're going to take a station break. When we return, we're going to explore in greater detail what is the landscape of historically black colleges and universities. What's their origin? What's their history? What's the current state? And what's the projected future reality that we might anticipate? And we're having these discussions in what is called the International Decade for People of African Descent, 2015 to 2024. And of course, we've already lost 2 years in this 10-year period. So we have a lot of work to do. Many people don't even know that it is happening and what they can do with it. To celebrate, to augment the 3 principles of recognition, justice, and development. So stay tuned, and in fact, call your friends and families to join in, because you certainly are getting a treat today with our guests. See you after the break. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Race Treaty. This is your host, Onaje Mweed, and we have as our guest Brother Ray Winbush, who is a scholar, an author, a researcher, a psychologist, an educator, a human rights activist, and a phenomenal, beautiful human being who's here to make this world and has made this world a better place. And this second part of the show, we're going to have him talk to us about what is usually referred to as historically black colleges and universities. And I'll start off by saying that we must ground our conversation in the work of Carter G. Woodson. In his book in 1933, he said that the miseducation of the Negro. And he said that when our children go to these institutions, we come out not having a love and a commitment to our people, but in fact, contempt for our people. So how then could institutions be identified as historically black institutions when in fact the product of those institutions in fact is a black inferiority in some cases, not in all, but in some cases. So please give us a little history of historically black institutions and what was that history based upon?
Well, the history a black institution, black higher education, HBCU, historically black colleges and universities. Some people refer to them now as HBIs, historically black institutions, is that they were set up in a system of American apartheid to deliberately segregate black people away from white people. They didn't want us going to their schools. The first historically black college in the United States was Cheney University in Pennsylvania, right outside of Philly. That was founded in 1837. That's the oldest one. There's always been this kind of dispute between Cheney and Lincoln University, which is, also in Pennsylvania, because it was founded in 1854. And the Lincoln people always say, well, Cheney was another institution. So I'll leave that argument to them. But I always call it, Cheney really was the oldest one, 1837. And these institutions were established, again, to segregate black folk. They didn't want black people coming to white schools. And so they said, well, you go to that school. And they really expected these schools to fail. And the land grant institutions didn't come around till, many, many years later. And land grant institutions, of course, were institutions set up by the state, Ohio State University, Indiana State University. These were the institutions that were publicly run, and they wouldn't allow us to go to those schools either, even though we were paying taxes for them. So then they set up land grant institutions for black people. So that's why many of the schools, like I used to teach at Alabama A&M, Agriculture and Mining University, or North Carolina A&T. Those were all black colleges, and of course, those were the public ones. And then we also had private, like in probably the most famous private institution is Tuskegee University, founded by Booker T. Washington. Howard University is unique in that sense that it's funded by the federal government directly, but it's semi-private, and that's the only one like that. So these schools that were set up, they prospered. They got big. 7 of them now are celebrating their 150th anniversary, because, including Morgan State, where I teach, because many of them, of course, were founded right after the Civil War in 1867. I'm sorry, I want to make sure I got that right. 150 years ago is what? Not 1857. Yeah, I think it is 1867, right after the Civil War. Anyway, they were founded, and white people thought they were going to fail. But these schools not only didn't fail, but they produced some of the great leadership in the African community, not only nationally, but internationally. Kwame Nkrumah, for example, graduated from Lincoln University, as did the first president of Nigeria. But we also, if I started naming some of the people from Toni Morrison to Samuel L. Jackson, Martin Luther King, Julian Bond, P. Diddy, Marion Barry in Washington, former mayor of Washington, D.C. I mean, black leadership, Jesse Jackson, Kwame Ture, George Padmore. If you just started naming them, you would be here for a long time. Nikki Giovanni, John Hope Franklin, and other examples, Judith Jamison, Janetta Cole. So the black leadership in this country and around the world were produced by these little over 100 of these HBCUs around the nation. And so not only did they prosper, but they were graduating. And lest I forget, one of the most important graduates, W.B. Du Bois from Fisk University, where I used to teach. They went on to literally shape thought and ideas about what it meant to be black in America and actually black in the world. So there was jealousy about these institutions. These institutions had a lot of violence directed towards them. The Fish Jubilee Singers, when I was teaching there, it has a bell tower on Jubilee Hall, and that the reason why usually on these campuses there was one very tall building was to be a lookout post for night riders such as the Klan that came after these schools. When Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, Fisk University was completely surrounded by the National Guard. Students couldn't get in or get out because people thought that they were the leaders of some of the so-called riots, terms I prefer as rebellions that occurred in the cities in the wake of Dr. King's assassination. So you had all of this. And so these schools continue to grow. They continue to prosper. We've lost some along the way, of course, but they're still out there. And it's always, strikes me that we never have articles written like, do we still need Catholic universities like Notre Dame, or do we still need all women's universities like Sarah Lawrence, or do we still need Jewish universities like Brandeis? But you'll see articles that do we still need black colleges, in the United States. I think the reason why there's a hostile and has always been a hostile attitude towards black colleges is because they are historical reminders of the racism that's embedded in this country at every level. And so we want to get rid of them so that we don't have to be reminded of them and reminded of the past that this country, or what this country did to black people.
Thank you for that very informative history. So, I want to ask you, what is the current state and maybe of affairs? And maybe you can start with Morgan. Of course, you start at the beginning, but what is the current state of affairs of Morgan?
Well, Morgan is considered one of the premier black colleges in this country. I mean, we're in the top 5 of producing black engineers, for example, in this country, and that includes MIT and all these other schools, PhDs in several areas of engineering. Fisk, little old Fisk, that only has about 600 students, was rated in the top 10 of institutions with physics department. In fact, the first black woman to get a degree in astrophysics was a Fisk graduate. Morgan has joined, there's 4 HBCUs in the state of Maryland, Bowie State, Coppin State, University of Maryland at Eastern Shore, and of course Morgan. And recently, well, I shouldn't say recently, about 11 years ago, a lawsuit was filed on behalf, the alums of these black colleges got together and sued the state of Maryland for past histories of racism and segregation. And the lawsuit has been going on now for roughly 11 years. Recently, in November, the judge ruled that the HBCUs had a case. And so now, after 11 years of us documenting this and proving that there was a past pattern of racism and segregation, they're now in the phase of saying, how do you remedy that? We sued the state, or the alums sued the state for $2.1 billion. And that was considered, quote, in the judge's order, impractical. So now they're supposed to be coming up. We're supposed to be huddling with the white schools, the TWIs, as they're called, traditionally white institutions, and trying to come up with a remedy that will deal with this lawsuit. And this is not the first one. In 1992, the state of Mississippi, in the Fordyce case, United States versus Fordyce, they sued in the state of Mississippi There was another one in 1981 in Alabama, Knight versus the state of Alabama. In fact, I testified in that trial along with one of my faculty members at the University of Chicago, Edgar S. And in both of those cases, we proved, we being black college folks, proved that there was a historical pattern of racism in terms of funding, duplication of programs. For example, Morgan has one of the best MBA programs, Masters of Business Administration, among black colleges in the country. But Towson University, which is about 5 or 6 miles from Morgan, they set up a duplicate program because they knew that their white community or whatever constituents didn't want to really go to Morgan State. And instead of the state of Maryland saying, look, there's an MBA program right there at Morgan State, we're not going to give Towson. They set up these programs at these, what they call duplicative programs at white institutions. That's racism, and we proved that. And so now we're going to try to deal with the remedy, and the white schools are angry about it, of course, because they're basically saying that, we said the jig is up. You got to do something about this stuff. So, so Morgan is in good shape financially. We've got, roughly 8,000 students on the campus now. The newest building, the second newest building on campus, it was opened last year, is the Earl Gray Schools of Business, because Earl Gray's the founder of Black Enterprise Magazine, graduated from Morgan, has been very generous, and so we named the School of Business after him. So we're in good shape, seeing what the end's going to be, as our ancestors said.
Ray, you mentioned a few words. I'm going to cherry pick, if you will. I'm going to pull some words together. You mentioned billions of dollars. You've mentioned the word remedy. You mentioned, something has to be done about this. And for me, when I hear those words, it really brings me to one of your books, Should America Pay? Slavery and the Raging Debate on Reparations. And I'm asking you about this concept, this remedy called reparations. And first, I'm going to ask you to give us some idea of how much of that discussion is actually happening inside of historically black colleges and universities.
Well, it's happening spasmodically on Najee. This past summer, I called an invitation-only conference with some of the leading scholars and activists around the nation to meet in Morgan to talk about the state of reparations. We had Claude Anderson there. Some of you know him. Matsumela, who does radio on XM radio. Conrad Will out of Chicago. We called together about Cam Howard was there, and Ajuaya Toro, the founder of Incoba, one of the founders of GER. All of us were there, and we huddled as a think tank for 2.5 days to talk about the state of reparations, and created the hashtag 40 to talk about that we've been tweeting about and stuff like that, and really doing some organizing. I would say this, that reparations on HBCU campuses, something that people talk about, do some organizing about, and it's more intense on other campuses like where I am and where some of my colleagues are than they are. And it's a lot of it on, TWI campuses as well. It depends. I think reparations in my book, Should America Pay? It is the only political struggle and political idea that African people throughout the world resonate towards. They say you can go to I don't know, Kumasi in Ghana, or Joburg in South America, and in South Africa, and you will still hear people saying, if you say reparations, black folks say, yeah, these white people owe us something. Or you can go to Brooklyn and talk about it. So it's a unifying concept. There have been reparations given, but we're still waiting for what some people call the big payoff and the big payday that will eventually happen. And we know it's going to happen. And people are talking about it more now than they ever have been. And I think that what is happening with the HBCU lawsuit here in Maryland is a form of reparation. I think that what happened in Chicago a couple of years ago with those cops beating up people in the city of Chicago paying reparations is another form. Reparations is not a check in the mail. It's doing compensatory justice for historical wrong. And I think there's a lot of that going on, not only in this country, but in the Caribbean with the formation of CARICOM, on the African continent, increasingly. We see it throughout the world. It's a struggle.
So, given that, of course, we would probably want to reference United Nations work on the subject, namely basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparations for victims of gross violations of international human rights laws and serious violations of international humanitarian law, that was authored by Van Boven. And Boven, in his report, said that reparations first report had three things: compensation, restitution, and rehabilitation. And certainly as a psychologist, you have spent most of your life working in the area of rehabilitation, and we're going to have you back on that. But he also said another thing later. He said there has to be a monitoring mechanism to look at the way people are continually treated, even after reparations are actually afforded and granted. And this is the work that the founder of Race Treaty, this program, has been saying for a number of years. Brother Robert Benton has said that we have to have some mechanism that can record the ways in which we are being mistreated and document it unapologetically that it's happening in many places. And I'll go further to say the work of the brother out of University of North Carolina, whose name escapes me.
William Darity.
No. The brother, he's written this thing called, he's created this website called Black Asheville. And right now I'm just having a brain freeze. But he has put together a whole system of looking at a town and looking at the way in fact black people are treated in Asheville. And we are proposing that should be the template that needs to be replicated in all areas of where black people are living, so we can really get some idea of the cumulative effect of institutional racism and how it's negatively affecting these communities. So compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, and a monitoring system. And so we're starting from the back end in terms of putting that monitoring system together. And certainly we will invite you back to share with us what was the results of this conference that you held with these scholars and activists on the question of reparations. And certainly, Ray, as we get ready to close, let me ask you, I know you and I were both delegates at the Durban conference in South Africa, United Nations conference against racism. And that was in 2001. Now it's 2017. We have the International Decade for People of African Descent, looking at the themes of recognition, justice, and development. Where do you see us at this point in time, and how and what role do you think historically Black colleges and universities should be playing in that effort for reparations?
Well, I think they should be playing a major role, and I've encouraged that. We find support of it at places like Morgan State, at Fisk, at Howard, with Brother Greg Carr over there. I think increasingly as the world shrinks relative to the internet, and we can get our message out better right now. Callie House, 100 and something odd years ago, got 600,000 ex-enslaved Africans to sign a petition. We can do the same thing here now for reparations. So I'm encouraged. The lawsuit that CARICOM and the Caribbean has filed at a Black college, University of West Indies. I think I'm encouraged. I've never been discouraged about reparations, So I hope to see us playing a bigger role. And, I think that the scholarship as well as the legal stuff is going to be continuing. You're talking about Dwight Mullen down there, aren't you?
Yes, yes. That's
Brother Dwight is doing great work. It's a great model. Model.
Yeah. Excellent. I get by with the help from my friends.
All right, brother.
Thank you.
That's all right.
So, listen, audience, we have had the pleasure and honor of speaking to our beloved brother, Ray Winbush, Tikari Bioko, who has given his life to the struggle of the upliftment, the understanding, the upliftment of our people, and the creation of a better world. And we wish him all the very best on this day of Kwanzaa, Ujamaa, cooperative economics. We wish you the most happiest Kwanzaa and certainly a fruitful 2018. Brother Ray, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brother Anaji.
Peace and blessings.